Critique of Postcolonial Reason, Toward a History of the Vanishing Present by Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Starting with the preface. My aim to begin with was to track the figure of the native informant through various practices: philosophy, literature, history, culture. Soon, I found that the tracking showed up a colonial subject detaching itself from the native informant. After 1989, I began to sense that a certain post-colonial subject had, in turn, been recoding the colonial subject and appropriating the native informant's position. Today, with globalization in full swing, telecommunicated informatics taps the native informant directly in the name of indigenous knowledge and advances by piracy. Therefore, the foreclosure that I see operative in Chapter 1 continues rather more aggressively. The Encyclopedia of Life Support Systems, projected by UNESCO, defines the Aboriginal period of human history as the timescale of the far past, associated with inactive approaches in which there is no concern for environmental degradation and sustainability. It was, of course, as impossible for the Aboriginal to think sustainability as it was for Aristotle to decipher the secret of the expression of value, because of the historical limitation inherent in the society in which they lived. Encyclopedia of Life Support Systems, Conceptual Framework, Whitstable, Oyster Press, page 13, Karl Marx, A Critique of Political Economy, translated by Let's get those. Yet the practical philosophy of living in the rhythm of the ecobiome must not be dismissed as no concern. Assaulted by this dynamic, my book charts a practitioner's progress from colonial discourse studies to transnational cultural studies. The latter position, a moving base, that I stand on as the text seeks to catch the vanishing present, has inserted itself in narrative footnotes. Some will find this irritating and confusing. Some, I hope, will share the challenge. The implied reader, whose face I discover in Chapter 4, is too diversified to be assigned a definitive interest, a definitive preparation. Based on my own uncertain scholarship, I sometimes conjure up a lexicon consulting reader for the new cultural studies. The book tries also to address the sanctioned ignorance of the theoretical elite and of the self-styled academic practitioner. The sanctions, too, are of heterogeneous provenance. Thus, the reader's place is as unsecured as the writer's. But is that not the status of all texts, resisted in the writing and the reading? The first chapter looks at philosophy, how Kant foreclosed the Aboriginal, how Hegel put the other of Europe in a pattern of normative deviations, and how the colonial subject sanitized Hegel, how Marx negotiated difference. The second chapter reads a cluster of literary texts to show how colonialism and post-coloniality are figured: Bronte, Mary Shelley, Baudelaire, Kipling, Ries, Mahasweta, Coetzee. In my reading, Mary Shelley joins the last three on that list in not presenting the ethics of alterity as the politics of identity. A lesson for our struggle. Today I would have added at least Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy, a powerful paratactic text that loses nothing of its cutting edge against the exploiters, because it dares, in closing, to dissolve the central character's proper name by an alterity beyond its choice, so that it can claim, in the subjunctive, the right responsibility of loving, denied to the subject that wishes to choose agency from victimage. The third chapter follows a 19th century hill queen through the archives and ponders the management of widow burning. I should perhaps mention that it contains a revision of Can the Subaltern Speak?, which was originally published in Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture, edited by Crary Nelson and Lawrence Grossberg, Urbana University Law Press. The fourth chapter looks at postmodern fashion and the place of women in the history of textile. In addition to Can the Subaltern Speak?, earlier versions or portions of this text have been published as follows: The Rainy of Sir an essay in reading the archives, History and Theory, 3 Women's Texts on a Critique of Imperialism, Critical Inquiry, 12, number 1, 243 to 261, Imperialism and Sexual Difference. These chapters do not stand alone. They are loosely strung on a chain that may be described this way: the philosophical presupposition, historical excavations, and literary representations of the dominant, insofar as they are shared by the emergent postcolonial. Also, trace the subliminal and discontinuous emergence of the native informant. autochthone and or subaltern. This is not a trope expressed through the speech, writing an image of a third world literature. How it displaces itself from impossible perspective to resistant networks as well as super-exploited objects is part of the story. The problematic as well as super-exploited object is part of the story. The problematic of textile seems to contain a coda. In the telling, the chain cuts often, but the cut threads reappear, I hope. This is a feminist book. Feminist issues are pre-emergent, Raymond Williams' word, in the first chapter. They are the substance of the rest. In the fourth, a critique of contemporary culturalist, universalist feminism is offered. This book belongs on the same shelf as the works of Bell Hooks, Dennis Kendioti, Ketu Katrak, Wadnima Lubiano, Trenti Minha, Chandra Talpad Mohanty, Aiwa Ong, Sarah Suleri. During the years of writing this book, these women and others that I have not named here have advanced postcolonial feminist studies greatly. Suleri and I concentrate more on mainstream texts. An acknowledged similarities between these scholars' works and mine are proof that we are in a common struggle, but I concentrate more on mainstream texts even as I try to probe what subaltern is strategically excluded from organized resistance. The feminism we inhabit has something like a relationship with the tradition of the cultural dominant, even when adversarial. Chandra Mohanty has an eloquent passage about SIWA, Self-Employed Women's Association, in her new book. It was precisely because, in spite of the leaders, women's workers and capitalist groups' ideologies, domination, common interest, and the politics of solidarity. It was precisely because, in spite of the leaders' repeated admonition to the then young lawyer, Ella Bahat, but how will you organize them? These women have no employers, that Miss Bahat brought into the category self-employed, and as the first move in her unique revolutionary project, exhorted these women to put together a bare minimum in order to found a bank. Otherwise, they would have remained strategically excluded from the organized labor's movement. And today I have heard Nicola Armatrad of Women's World Bank repeatedly cite SIWA when asked what social work WWB undertakes, and cite Chandra Ben of SIWA as holding her hand and saying that WWB is their benefactor. It is my belief that a training in a literary habit of reading the world can attempt to put a curb on such superpowered triumphalism only if it does not perceive acknowledgement of complicity as an inconvenience. My book is therefore a critique in that it examines the structures of the production of postcolonial reason. Without this power to proceed minus the cleanest bill of health, we are caught between two worlds. On the one hand, theories, however strictly argued, that support the idea that upward class mobility, mimicry, and masquerade is unmediated resistance. On the other, a failure to recognize the passing of an era that, when the West, and particularly the Americans, were willing to tolerate the rhetoric of the Third World. James Traub, Kofi Annan's next test. The task of the teacher of literary reading is placed in the aporia of an uncoercive rearrangement of the will as student and teacher shuttle between freedom from and freedom to, not in congratulating the will to U.S. class power as immediate resistance. Thus, although both Ijaz Ahmad and I criticize the metropolitan postcolonialism, I hope my position is less locationist, more nuanced, with a productive acknowledgement of complicity. I always attempt to look around the corner, to see ourselves as others would see us. Not, however, in the interest of work stoppage, but so that work is less clannish. What I continue to learn from deconstruction is perhaps idiosyncratic, but it remains my reign. I am not erudite enough to be interdisciplinary, but I can break rules. Can anything be learned from this? I asked my two former students who suffered through most of the earlier parts of my book in the form of classroom teachings, Jenny Sharp and Trey Pyle. And for the last part, my thanks to the three who have made possible my other learning, Maswatadi, Farida, Farhad. Chapter 1, Philosophy. Postcolonial studies unwittingly commemorating a lost object can become an alibi unless it is placed within a general frame. Colonial discourse studies, when they concentrate only on the representation of the colonized or the matter of the colonies, can sometimes serve the production of current neocolonial knowledge by placing colonialism/imperialism securely in the past, and/or by suggesting a continuous line from that past to our present. This situation complicates the fact that postcolonial/colonial discourse studies is becoming a substantial subdisciplinary ghetto. In spite of the potential for co-optation, however, there can be no doubt that the apparently crystalline disciplinary mainstream runs muddy if these studies do not provide a persistent dredging operation. Because this dredging is counterproductive when it becomes a constant and self-righteous shaming of fully intending subjects, deconstruction can help here. It is not accidental that in spite of Derrida's repeated invocations of disciplinary matters and the crisis of European consciousness, the few attempts at harnessing deconstruction to these ends are not considered germane to deconstructive literary or philosophical critique. 1. For disciplinary matters, see Qui a peur de la philosophie? Flammarion, 1977. The Principle of Reason. The mainstream has never run clean, perhaps never can. Part of mainstream education involves learning to ignore this absolutely, with a sanctioned ignorance. Therefore, in this opening chapter 1, read 3 central texts of the Western philosophical tradition, texts that sanction. In conclusion to the 3 worlds, Karl Plush writes, "Our challenge is not merely to cast aside this conceptual ordering of social scientific labor into 3 worlds, but to criticize it. And we must understand the task of criticism in the Kantian, Hegelian, and Marxist sense here. We must, in other words, overcome the limitations that the 3 worlds notion has imposed upon the social sciences as a matter of course." Karl Plush, "The 3 worlds are in the division of social scientific labor, blah, blah." It is beyond the scope of this book to demonstrate how the new North-South divide in the post-Soviet world imposes new limitations, although my argument will constantly seek to escape that caution. 3. This sentence was written at the start of final revision and self-dislocated by the author's current active shuffling between North and South. This book is a practitioner's progress from this colonial discourse studies to transnational cultural studies. I report, therefore, that in the last chapter in the globalized, electronified, virtualized name of women, my reach exceeded my grasp and the caution gave way. The footnotes got longer, more narrative, pushing into the text. To those interested in deconstruction, given that I regularly maul the necessary but impossible model so grievously, I ask, is this a vulgar version of what was, with intent undertaken in Borderlines and Circumfessions, Derrida living on Borderlines and Harold Bloom? And blah, blah, blah. We may, however, suggest that our grasp on that process is made more secure if we in the humanities, Plush writes of the social sciences, see the 3rd world as a displacement of the old colonies, as colonialism proper displaces itself into neocolonialism. By neocolonialism, I always mean the largely economic rather than the largely territorial enterprise of imperialism. The difference between colonialism and imperialism, crucial to historians, is not of the less importance here. The post-Soviet situation has moved this narrative into the dynamics of the financialization of the globe. 4. Thus industrial, and specifically post-industrial, capitalism is now in an interruptive difference with commercial capital. World trade with finance capital markets. To notice this difference is to learn from Derrida, yet Derrida's own resolute ignoring of the difference between the two is caught within it. This inside-out relationship with something called deconstruction, to be mentioned in an anticipatory footnote, is also one of the driving motors of this book. For interruption, in this sense, see Marx's description of the relationship between the 3 circuits of capital and Karl Marx, Capital, a Critique of Political Economy. For this sense of difference, see Derrida, Difference, in Margins of Philosophy. We must grapple practically with the curious fact that difference cannot have a sense, not just covering comprehension with mockery. For Derrida's apparent ignorance, or ignoring, of the difference between industry and finance, see Spivak, Limits and Openings of Marx and Derrida, and Outside in the Teaching Machine, and Ghostwriting, Diacritics. These great narratives are becoming increasingly more powerful operating principles, and we in the U.S. read Kant, Hegel, Marx as remote discursive precursors rather than as transparent or motivated repositories of ideas. 5. As always and in general, I find most useful the later discredited notion of discursive formations in Part 3 of Michael Foucault, The Archaeology of Knowledge. By discursive production, I mean something that is among the conditions as well as the effect of a general system in the formation and transformation of statements, analysis. I keep hoping that some readers may then discover a constructive rather than disabling complicity between our own positions and theirs, for there often seems no choice between excuses and accusations. The muddy stream and mudslinging. As the century spanning the production of Kant and Marx progresses, the relationship between European discursive production and the axiomatics of imperialism also changes, although the latter continues to play the role of making the discursive mainstream appear clean, and of making itself reappear as the only negotiable way. In the course of this unceasing operation, and in one way or another, an unacknowledgeable moment that I will call the native informant is crucially needed by the great texts, and it is foreclosed. I borrow the term foreclosure, foreclusion, from Lacanian psychoanalysis. I read psychoanalysis as a technique for reading the pre-emergence, Raymond Williams term, of narrative as ethical instantiation. 6. I have discussed this approach in Echo and Donna Landry and Gerald McLean's edition, The Spivak Reader. I repeat some of that general argument later in this chapter. Let me sketch this technique briefly by way of the entry for foreclosure in a still useful general lexicon of the passage between Freud and Lacan, the language of psychoanalysis. 7. Jean Laplanche and J.B. Pontelis, the language of psychoanalysis, translated Donald Nicholson Smith. All the quotations about foreclosure are from these pages. My implied reader, who figures herself forth in Chapter 4, will be obliged to consult lexicons. As language points out, the sense brought to the fore by Lacan is to be found, for instance, in what Freud writes, about a much more energetic and successful kind of defense. Here, the ego rejects the incompatible idea together with the effect and behaves as the idea had never occurred to the ego at all. The work from which Lacan has most readily derived support for his idea of foreclosure is the case history of the Wolfman. The idea of the rejection of an affect can direct us into the dislocating of psychoanalytic speculation from practical science, for which specialized training is recommended. To ethical responsibility, a burden of being human, it is also useful to remember that it was the history of the Wolfman analysis that led Nicholas Abraham and Maria Tarok into the thinking of cryptonymy, the encrypting of a name. Cryptonymy. 8. Nicholas Abraham and Maria Tarkov, the Wolfman's magic word, cryptonymy. Derrida, who works this dislocation by disclaiming responsibility within the circuit of the production and consumption of psychoanalytic practice, mimes the encrypting of the patronymic and the search for the impossible matronymic in a text of Mourning for His Father. 9. I discussed this in Spivak, class piece, A Compte Rendu Diacritics, as Derrida elaborates on the gift of death. The situation between father and son is a basic side of the conflict between ethics and sacrifice in the Jewish tradition. In this chapter, I shall docket the encrypting of the name of the native informant as the name of man, a name that carries the inaugurating effect of being human. We cannot diagnose a psychosis here, but we can supplement the ethical Freud, who wrote The Unease, Unbehagen of Civilization, with this thought, that this rejection of effect served and serves as the energetic and successful defense of the civilizing mission. As the lexicon traces the development of the idea in Freud, it mentions that the idea comprises an inner-outer switch, an integral withdrawal of cathexis, Besitzung, that becomes a disavowal, Verleumdung, of the real world. 10. One might think this withdrawal within the circuit of Besitzung occupation, Gesetz, law, Sitzung, posting, therefore is as proposition, the native informant, lesser breeds beyond the law slips out of the enunciated statement of being human. How, in the last reckoning, are we to understand the sorts of repression into the external world? The withdrawal of cathexis, Besitzung, is also a withdrawal of significance, Bedeutung. Taking this insight out two-step as his guide, Lacan defines foreclosure, a translation of Freud into his own language, as what has been foreclosed from the symbolic reappears in the real. Thus, foreclosure relates to a Freudian primary process, embodying two complementary operations, the Einsichtung ins Ich, introduction into the subject, and the Ausstoßung aus dem Ich, expulsion from the subject. The real is or carries the mark of that expulsion. I think of the native informant as a name for that mark of expulsion from the name of man, a mark crossing out the impossibility of of the ethical relation. I borrow the term from ethnography, of course, in that discipline the native informant, although denied autobiography as it is understood in the Northwestern European tradition, codename West, is taken with utmost seriousness. He, and occasionally she, is a blank, though generative of a text of cultural identity that only the West, or a Western model discipline, could inscribe. The practice of some benevolent cultural nativists today can be compared to this. Although the cover story there is of a fully self-present voice consciousness, increasingly there is the self-marginalizing or self-consolidating migrant, or post-colonial masquerading as a native informant. I am discovering the native informant clear out of this cluster. The texts I read are not ethnographic, and therefore do not celebrate this figure. They take for granted that the European is the human norm, and offer us descriptions and or prescriptions. And yet, even here, the native informant is needed and foreclosed. In Kant, he is needed as the example for the heteronomy of the determinate, to set off the autonomy of the reflexive judgment, which allows freedom for the rational will. In Hegel, as evidence for the spirit's movement from the unconscious to the consciousness, in Marx as that which bestows normativity upon the narrative of the modes of production. These moves and various guises still inhabit and inhibit our attempts to overcome the limitations imposed on us by the newest division of the world, to the extent that, as the North continues ostensibly to aid the South, as formerly imperialism civilized the New World, the South's crucial assistance to the North is keeping up its resource-hungry lifestyle, is forever foreclosed. In the pores of this book will be the suggestion that the typecase of the foreclosed native informant today is the poorest woman of the South. But the period and text under our considerations in this chapter will produce, to cite Gramsci's uncanny insight, the native informant as a site of enlisted traces. To steer ourselves through the Sicilla of cultural relativism and the Chabrides of nativist culturalism, regarding this period, we need a commitment not only to narrative and counter-narrative, but also to the rendering impossible of another narrative. As my opening quotation from Pletsch betrays, our sense of critique is too thoroughly determined by Kant, Hegel, and Marx for us to be able to reject them as motivated imperialists, although this is too often the vain gesture performed by critics of imperialism. A deconstructive politics of reading would acknowledge the determination as well as the imperialism and see if the magisterial text can now be our servants, as the new magisterium constructs itself in the name of the other. 11. See once again Derrida, of Grammatology. Translated Spivak. Foucault's historical fable locates the breakdown of the discourse of sovereignty and the emergence of the micrology of power at the end of the French and British 18th century. In the same fabulating spirit, one might suggest that the end of the German 18th century, if one can speak of Germany as a unified proper name in that era, provides material for a narrative of crisis management, the scientific fabrication of new representations of self and world that would provide alibis for the domination, exploitation, and epistemic violation entailed by the establishment of colony and empire. As we move within the great narratives of cultural self-representation, it is appropriate to note that Germany's imperialist adventures did not consolidate themselves until the latter part of the 19th century. 12. See John Noe's Colonial Space, Spatiality, and the Discourse of German Southwest Africa. As a starting point, although theoretically derivative, its documentation is helpful. As its title indicates, it does not cover all of Germany's colonial adventure. The narrative of German cultural self-representation within the Western European context is therefore one of difference. Its very singularity provides a sort of link with that earlier scenario of self-representation that would not allow the name German, a lack of unified nationhood that could only find a fuller founding through the rediscovery of a German antiquity, a lack of participation in the European Renaissance that would not nonetheless allow a modern and active reenactment of the Renaissance. In Ontotheology of National Humanism, prolegomena to a hypothesis, Oxford Literary Review, Derrida quotes Karl Grun, against whom Marx ironizes with some verve, as typical of a specifically German trend, which he locates earlier in Fichte, and by the way of which, in the name of an apolitical people which is not a people, the national philosophical assertion of a cosmopolitanism states its paradoxes, which are also paradigms for the future. We shall find the recurrent effects of this on the most opposite sides in Heidegger as well as Adorno. Jürgen Habermas, whose work presents itself as a paradigm for the future from within post-war Germany, may perhaps also be read within this trend in mind. It is hard to plot the lines by which a people, metanomically, that group within it that is self-consciously the custodian of culture, construct the explanations that establish its so-called cultural identity. Yet it cannot be denied that such lines are drawn and redrawn. If we think of the ways in which our cultural identities and roles are negotiated and renegotiated, implicitly and explicitly, by ways of great narratives ranging from the popular to the scholarly, it is not implausible to make the following suggestion. Cultural and intellectual Germany, the place of self-styled difference from the rest of what is still understood as continental Europe and Britain, was the main source of the meticulous scholarship that established the vocabulary of proto-archetypal comparative in the disciplinary sense, identity or kinship, without direct involvement in the utilization of that other difference between the colonizer and the colonized, in the nascent discourses of a comparative philology, comparative religion, even comparative literature, the difference in tone between a William Jones and a Herder, taxonomizing Sanskrit and thinking alterity by a way of language culture, respectively, will bring home my point. Africa remained a place apart on this network of possible identity, a place that provoked bafflement or hysteria. 14. See V.Y. Mudembi, The Invention of Africa, Gnosis, Philosophy, and the Order of Knowledge, for a philosophical account of the resistance to this phenomenon. Very careful analysis of the contemporary fallout of the separation and the academic subdivision of labor. See the Yearbook of Comparative and General Literature, 1985. The field of philosophy as such, whose model was the merging of science and truth, remained untouched by the comparative impulse. In this area, Germany produced authoritative and universal narratives where the subject remained unmistakably European. These narratives, Kant, Cosmopolitia, Hegel's itinerary of the idea, Marxist socially homeopathy, neither inaugurated nor consolidated a specifically scholarly control of the matter of imperialism. Karl Pletsch's admonition to us to be Kantian, Hegelian, and Marxist, and our dismantling of Third Worldist talk is yet another example of their influence in the formation of the European ethico-political subject. In my estimation, these source texts of European ethico-political self-representation are also complicitous with what is today a self-styled post-colonial discourse. On the margins of my reading is the imagined and impossible perspective I have called the native informant, ostentatiously to turn one's back on, say, this trio, when so much of one's critique is clearly, if sometimes unwittingly, copied from them, is to disavow agency, declare kingdom come by denial of history. On the other hand, to imagine that the positioning of the other remains the same in all their work is to assume that the only real engagement with the other is in the objective social science disciplines after all. My point is that we in the humanities dealing with the position of the other as an implied subjective position must also vary our assumptions depending upon the texts with which we are dealing. Paradoxically, every questioner who enters the book trade does so as a species of native informant, or has been trained from infancy 4 hours every day, even if reactively, in some version of an academic culture that has accommodated these three fellows, often in their radical margins, but sometimes also in their conservative centers. I write in the conviction that sometimes it is best to sabotage what is inexorably to hand than to invent a tool that no one will test, while mouthing varieties of liberal pluralism. I will call my reading of Kant mistaken. I believe there are just disciplinary grounds for irritation at my introduction of the empirical and the anthropological into a philosophical text that slowly leads us toward the rational study of morals as such. I rehearse it in the hope that such a reading might take into account that philosophy that has been and continues to be travestied in the service of the narrativization of history. My exercise may be called a scrupulous travesty in the interest of producing a counter-narrative that will make visible the foreclosure of the subject whose lack of access to the position of narrator is the condition of possibility of the consolidation of Kant's position, if the combination of these talents among them, mixing up the empirical with the rational, in one person produces only bunglers. Let us remember that bungling may be a synonym for intervention. Kant, Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals with Critical Essays. Kant's critique of pure reason charts the operation of the reason that cognizes nature theoretically. The critique of practical reason charts the operation of the rational will. The operations of the aesthetic judgment allow the play of concepts of nature with the concepts of freedom. The critique of judgment is divided into the aesthetic and the teleological. The section on aesthetic judgment is further divided into considerations of the beautiful and the sublime. 16. Kant, the Critique of Judgment, translated J.H. Bernard. All references to these texts are incorporated into my own. And the experience of the beautiful, the subject, without cognizing itself, constructs a seeming object of cognition without object reference. Pleasure in the beautiful is pleasure at the subject's capacity to represent an object of cognition without the reference necessary for true cognition. Here we see the connection between the aesthetic judgment and the realm of theoretical reason. The subject represents an object for cognition. Art allows the ungrounded play of the concept of nature, by which things can be cognized. In the moment of the sublime, the subject accedes to the rational will. It has often been noted that the rational will intervenes to cover over a moment of deprivation. There is, strictly speaking, no full experience of the sublime. The feeling of the sublime is a feeling of pain arising from the want of accordance between the aesthetical estimation formed by the imagination and the same formed by reason. But since this judgment of the inadequacy of our greatest faculty of sense is reasonable and correct, a pleasure is excited. The superiority of the rational over the sensible arouses in us the feeling of our supersensible determination, Bestimmung. 17. Bestimmung. Determination is translated many different ways in English. Because of the consistency of the metaphor and the concept in German, resounding and Stimme, voice, and Stimmung, among other things as a suggestion of tuning, I indicate the word whenever it occurs in Kant's text. It is not too excessive to say that we are programmed, or better tuned, to feel the inadequacy of the imagination, thus tripping the circuit to the superiority of reason, through the pain incited by the sublime. The language is persistently one of inescapable obligation, although the concept in question is that of freedom. The tendency for this determination, Bestimmung, lies in our nature, while its development and exercise remains incumbent and obligatory. Unlodged, the word often used by Kant and generally translated as tendency, carries the sense of a blueprint or program as well. Such a model of the programmed access to the concept of freedom as the pleasure of reason, exercising dominion over sensibility, implicitly presupposes that freedom generated by a determination or programming is a trope of freedom. Indeed, the feeling of the sublime in nature is a clandestine metalepsis, substitution of effect for cause. It is a respect for our own determination, Bestimmung, which by a certain subruption we attribute to an object of nature. It is a dissimulated exchange, Verwicklung, of respect for the object, natural, sublime, for respect for the idea of humanity in our subject. All this relates to the sublime in magnitude, not to the superior category of the dynamic sublime. I should like, however, to emphasize a few subjects of Kant's descriptive morphology that remain common to all that he wrote about the human access to the rational will. This access is structured like the programmed supplementation of a structurally necessary lack. To denominate this supplementation a feeling for nature is, at best, a metalepsis. By a certain subruption. Subruption is rather a strong word. That, in ecclesiastical law, means the suppression of truth to obtain indulgence. 18. In the inaugural dissertation, by analogy with the accepted meaning of the term subruption, Kant is hard on the metaphysical fallacy of subreption. Such hybrid axioms, hybrid in that they proffer what is sensitive as being necessarily bound up with the intellectual concept I call surreptitious axiom. Those principles of intellectual error that have most harmfully infested metaphysics have indeed proceeded from these spurious axioms. Kant, inaugural dissertation and early writings on space. On the next page, Kant goes on to propose the principle of the reduction of any surreptitious axiom. I consider its elaboration in the text. Indeed, in his discussion of the dynamic sublime, as might that has no dominion over us, Kant similarly marks the moment of improper displacement of the epithet upon nature, as he implies a certain inevitability of usage in it. Everything that excites this feeling of superiority to nature within and without us, in us, is called then, although improperly, sublime. The structure of the sublime is atropine. The sublime in nature is operated by a surreptitious impropriety. Our access to morality is operated by rhetoric and clandestinity. The critique of judgment repeatedly cautions us, therefore, against any attempt at cognitive control of the rational will. 19. In this connection, see Patrick Riley's critique of Hannah Arendt's lecture on Kant's political philosophy and on Deleuze's review of Arendt's lecture on Kant's political philosophy. The tuning of the mind, die Stimmung des Gemüts, the metaphor is the same as in Bestimmung, or determination, to the feeling of the sublime. The necessary structure of supplementation and compensation that I have described above requires its receptivity, fordert eine Empfänglichkeit to ideas. This receptivity, a natural possibility as part of the programming of determinate humanity, is actualized only by culture, Kultur, rather than Bildung, education or formation. Reason exerts a power over sensibility, Sinnlichkeit, in order to intend it adequately, Angemessen, to its proper realm, the practical, and to let it, lassen, look out upon, the infinite, which is for it an abyss. But although the judgment upon the sublime in nature needs culture, it is not therefore primarily produced by culture. It has its foundation, Grundlag, in human nature, in the tendency, Anlag, to the feeling for practical ideas, to the moral, zu dem Moralisch. Let us note this rather special inscription of a judgment programmed in nature, with needing culture but not produced by culture. It is not possible to become cultured in this culture if you are naturally alien to it. We should read Kant's description of the desirability of the proper humanizing of the human through culture within this frame of paradox. Without development of moral ideas, that which we, prepared by culture, call sublime, presents itself to man in the raw, dem rohen Menschen, merely as terrible. The adjective roh is suggestive. It is generally translated uneducated. In fact, in Kant, the uneducated are specifically by the child, and the poor, the naturally uneducable, is woman. 20. And the respective on Kant and Rousseau. Sarah Kaufman discusses the sublime as something the access to which is made possible by keeping woman at a distance. In this text, as well as in Genevieve Lloyd's The Man of Reason, Male and Female in Western Philosophy, and Beverly Brown's Gone for the 80s, comments on Hillis Miller's The Search for Grounds in Literary Studies, the treatment of the theme and figure of woman is shown to be demonstrated abundantly by Kant's text, even if it is often ruse of disavowal. As I hope to show, the figure of the native informant is by contrast foreclosed. Rhetorically crucial at the most important moment in the argument, it is not part of the argument in any way. Was it in this rift that the seeds of the civilizing mission of today's universalist feminists were sown? At best, it is a recoding and rhetoricalizing of the native informant as women of the South, so that she can be part of the argument. I consider the role of the UN-style initiative in the New World Order in the pores of this book. The wholesale Americanizing of Southern babies through adoption is another issue. Although the personal goodwill, indeed obsession, is in most of these cases unquestionable, one is also reminded of Cecil Rhodes's remark, mutatis mutandis. Of course, I contend that we are in the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. If there be a God, I think that what he would like me to do is to paint as much of the map of Africa British Red as possible. Quoted in L.S. Stravrianus, Global Rift, the Third World comes of age. In the domestic context, the problem was approached by what has now become a classic. Gloria T. Hole, all the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. Black Women's Studies. I am not suggesting that Kant's expressed view on the matter of colonialism and race to be found, for example, in relatively peripheral texts such as the third definitive article for a perpetual peace, or on the distinctiveness of races in general, should be ignored, although their assumptions are historically interpretable as well. I am suggesting that a revised politics of reading can give sufficient value to the deployment of rhetorical energy in the margins of the text acknowledged to be central. By contrast, der Roh Mensch, man in the Rome, can, in the signifying reach, accommodate the savage and the primitive.